Hello, hello. Awesome. All right. So we have a really amazing panel lined up for you today. This kind of gives you a taste of tomorrow. Tomorrow is going to be more research and policy focused, but this is going to give you kind of a little taste of that for the nerds in the room. So we're going to start with Brandon Enriquez, who's going to be presenting on the impact of the expanded child tax credit on labor force participation. Brandon's an economics PhD student at MIT, which is like the best school for economics in the country. That wasn't in his bio, that's me editorializing. He works on topics in labor economics, including wage garnishment, racial wage inequality, and labor supply responses to transfer programs. Next, we're going to have Eric Simmons and Nicole Russo from Ideas 42 talking about public opinion on guaranteed income and narrative change. Ideas 42 is a really amazing nonprofit organization, does a lot of broad work, including on guaranteed income. Eric's work specifically focuses on using principles drawn from applied behavioral science and implementation science to dismantle harmful poverty narratives. Nicole works on narrative change, benefits access, and public service improvement projects in the US. Her work includes applying behavioral insights to shift harmful narratives about poverty, unlock support for more generous social policy, and increase access to SNAP, Medicaid, cash assistance, and basic income. Finally, we have Sarah Constantino, who's assistant professor of psychology at Northeastern University. She also does an amazingly wide variety of work, including on the politics and impacts of guaranteed income programs. Before this, she was actually working on field work, which I think is like really cool for a psychology professor. I've never heard of that. Speaks to the broad range of her work. And she was also formerly a senior research fellow at the Jane Family Institute, which, getting to my own introduction, is where I work. And broadly, my work is about translating the principles of guaranteed income into policy. Anyway, that's enough introduction. Hopefully I've hyped you up for this amazing panel. But one small note, I want to, before we start, we are hoping to have some questions, time for questions from the audience at the end. So keep those questions in mind, and then when the presentations are over, we're going to have some time for those questions. Okay, so without further ado, Brandon.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Jack, for the kind words and for the invitation to be on the panel. I'm delighted to bring to you today my paper, The Short-Term Labor Supply Response to the Extended Child Tax Credit. This work is joint with Damon Jones, as well as Ernie Tedeschi. And so a quick disclaimer before we start. The views, opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed are strictly those of the authors. They don't reflect necessarily the views of the Council of Economic Advisors, the White House, or the United States government. And so to set the stage for this research, I want to first talk about the policy context surrounding work requirements and labor supply. And so as many people in this room are aware, there's been increasing shift in policy debates from traditional welfare programs to experimentation with work requirements, both for welfare and also for in-kind programs. So during the Clinton years in the 1990s, there were major changes to both welfare and to food stamps where work requirements were added. SNAP work requirements also changed during the most recent debt ceiling law, where there was an increase in work requirements for able-bodied adults without dependents. The age was raised from 50 to 55, and work requirements were dropped for homeless folks and for veterans. And so to recap some of the familiar arguments for and against these work requirements in policy circles. So for work requirements, it's in the views of proponents of work requirements, it reduces resources unnecessarily spent on people who could otherwise be working. And you often hear things like narratives about dependency on welfare. And so in the views of these folks, adding work requirements decreases the dependency that people may have on welfare, where being on welfare now may lead you to have less of a motivation to work in the future. The argument against work requirements is that it adds a lot of unnecessary paperwork barriers to this very vital aid for people and has essentially no effect on labor supply. And so in the background as I'm talking about that, there are these inescapable normative valuations about the purpose of these policy alleviation programs, who should be targeted, who is deserving. So our paper is focusing on describing the effects of the child tax credit and on understanding the economics of it. We're not going to speak to in this paper the normative valuations about who is deserving and who is not. Oh, oops. My bad.
Red to go back.
Red to go back. Okay, great. So having set the policy context, let's talk a little bit about the economics of work requirements. So on the empirical side, the evidence is overall mixed, and there's an active debate in the economics literature. So SNAP work requirements are generally shown to be ineffective at increasing work. It does increase program exit. There's a lot of debate in the literature on traditional welfare work requirements, but in general, total income falls when work requirements are introduced, although there is some increase in work generally found. In terms of the earned income tax credit, that's generally found to increase work, although the debates of who benefits the most, is it the people or is it employers of low-income people? There's been some recent debate about who benefits the most from that policy. On the theoretical side, there's a foundational paper by Besley and Coate, which says that work requirements can be efficient in the economic sense if it's effective at one of two things, right? So one is screening. And by screening, what these economists mean is that the work requirements have to be effective at being able to limit the aid to the people who would and could work if the work requirement were introduced. So if it's just throwing everybody off, that's not efficient in any sort of economic sense because these people are unnecessarily hurt. And then the last is deterrence. So if it is the case that there are things that people can do to reduce their likelihood of being in poverty, if you make welfare programs less generous, then they'll be induced or they'll be more likely to take those actions. And so an empirical prediction from this theory is that work requirements are optimal only if they increase labor supply. Now that's a necessary but not sufficient condition. Work requirements could increase labor supply and still not be socially efficient. But it is necessary that work requirements increase labor supply for them to be efficient in an economic sense. So we take the aforementioned empirical prediction directly to the data using or studying the child tax credit law that was passed as part of the American Rescue Plan in 2021. So Congress temporarily changed the tax credit from being phased in to being fully refundable. And so our research question is going to be, did this expanded child tax credit reduce labor supply? And so to study this, we're going to compare labor market outcomes for families who qualify for larger and smaller child tax credit transfers before or after the policy. We find no significant labor supply change in response, neither upon the introduction or the expiration of the payments. And then in terms of prior literature, two things to flag. So most other studies that have looked at this child tax credit law have also failed to find significant labor supply responses. And then the other thing is that we are estimating the response to a temporary extension of these benefits. We can't speak to what would happen if these benefits were made permanent. Those are, of course, hypothetical changes. We are looking at real outcomes in our study. So briefly, an overview of the institutional context. So the child tax credit was established in 1997, originally a tax credit for children under 17 years of age. The value increased from $500 to $2,000 per child over the 20 years from 1997 to 2017, which is a slight inflation-adjusted cut, even though it's an increase in nominal terms. Over time, it became partially refundable, up to 15% of income. And to receive that refundable portion, you needed to have a certain income of $10,000. Originally, over the subsequent 2 decades, that decreased to $2,500. So this is overall a large program. It is as big as Medicaid and the Children's Insurance Health Program. And the current version of the Child Tax Credit is defined by the Trump Tax Cut Bill, Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017. So in 2021, the Child Tax Credit was made fully refundable, which means it can be claimed even if the credit exceeds the person's tax liability. It increased for the lowest incomes from $2,000 to between $3,000 and $3,600 per child. These advance payments were sent out to people monthly, directly, from July 2021, to December 2021. And the critical detail for our study is that families with no earnings were eligible for the maximum amount, and the level of credit is invariant to earnings over the initial range. So there's no phase-in. The last point, why is this paper suitable to present at a conference about basic income guarantees? The reason why is that even though there is a phase out for the benefit, you can think of this as an unconditional cash transfer to children. All programs have some sort of phase out, either explicitly or implicitly through taxes, because they have to be funded somehow. And so we think of this as basically a basic income for children because there is no phase in. So let me show you what the benefit schedule looks like as a function of income. So if you look at the gray line, is there
no pointer, I don't think.
No laser pointer. Okay, so there's one thing that I'll call your attention to in this graph. So if you look at the 2 blue lines all the way on the left, you'll see that for families with an adjusted gross income of 0, they qualify for between $3,000 and $3,600 per child, sent directly to them, deposited in their bank accounts. The gray line is the prior law credit for children ages 0 through 16, and you'll see that for folks who are not working, who have adjusted gross income of 0, they earn 0 in the child tax credit. Great. So now another theory slide to think about what are the factors that may lead to lower versus greater versus ambiguous changes in labor supply in response to this particular law. And so the factors leading to lower labor supply are basically twofold. Number one is that there's an increase in the benefit size. Right? So if there is for any given level of consumption you may want to reach, you have to work a certain amount to reach that level of consumption. And if you get an unconditional benefit, that you don't need to work as much to receive that level of consumption. Economists call that an income effect. And so that income effect could lead to a lower labor supply. The second one is that it replaces a phase-in benefit from increasing the labor force with a more neutral benefit until phase-out. And so to break this down, so suppose that you have 0 income and you're not working. If there is a phase-in, then for each additional hour you work, you get your wage plus the additional benefits that are phasing in. And so the benefits, when there is a phase-in, increases your effective wage rate. This is what economists call a substitution effect. And theoretically, that could lead to lower labor supply in this context. The last thing to say is that for credit-constrained households, any disincentive effect will occur in every month because you don't have to wait until tax season to get that money. There's a countervailing force, of course, which is that credit-constrained households can use this benefit to overcome cost barriers that prevent work. Say, transportation costs, say childcare costs. And so that could increase labor supply. We can also see an ambiguous effect if the benefit supports longer job search. So you may, yeah. Enough there. Let me push forward. Hey, Jack, how much time? Like 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, wonderful. Let me push forward. So the data set that we're using is a national representative data set of about 60,000 households. The current population survey, it has monthly data on labor force participation, employment, hours, wages, and a categorical variable for family income over the last 12 months. That's something we convert to a continuous measure using an imputation method that I will refer you to the paper if you're interested in learning more details about. We do not see the actual child tax credit payments. We impute that using the program rules. We're going to group families by percentile of the child tax credit payment to income ratio, where we're using, again, eligibility for the measure, and we're going to limit to parents for obvious reasons. The main outcome of interest is going to be labor force participation, which is defined in the CPS as whether someone is employed or unemployed but actively looking for work. I forgot to go to the next slide, but that's my slide. Great. One slide on our methodology. We do what economists call a difference in difference estimation, which means we're going to make two comparisons. Number one, we're going to compare households with larger versus smaller ratios of child tax credit benefits are eligible for to income. Right. So households with a higher child tax credit to income ratio are going to be either lower income or they're going to have more kids. Now, you might say, okay, why not just make this comparison in the time when the payments were paid out? And the reason why is because there's already a pre-existing relationship between income level and the number of kids and labor force participation. And so we need to control for that. In order to do that, we're going to make a second comparison, which is before and after the expanded child tax credit benefit was paid out. And so we get a causal effect of child tax credit on labor supply under the assumption that in the absence of the payment, households who qualify for larger or smaller amounts would have had similar trends in labor force participation. All right, and so to probe this assumption, we're also going to run an analysis in 2019, which is what we call a placebo analysis in economics. We're going to do that to rule out seasonal confounders, such as the fact that higher employment during the Christmas season is observed for low-income households. And we're also going to look at the expiration of the benefit to give us a second test for labor supply effects. Now to get to the results. So this shows the labor force participation rate by percentile of child tax credit to income ratio that you're eligible for. You'll notice that there is a downward sloping relationship during this time period. This reflects the fact that at baseline, lower income households participate in the labor force at lower amounts. Now, when we run our double difference specification, in blue, we have the relationship between labor force participation and child tax credit before the rollout of the expanded benefit. In pink, we see the relationship after. So if there was a negative effect of the child tax credit on labor supply, we would expect for the pink line to be below the blue line. Moreover, we would expect for the gap to be larger for households that qualify for larger child tax credit payments relative to their income. We don't see that. We see that the lines are essentially right on top of one another, and if you test statistically if there is a difference, there is none. And so this rejects the hypothesis that the child tax credit reduced labor supply. Next, we see our placebo analysis in 2019, looking again at the relationship between labor force participation and child tax credit eligibility, and we see no systematic difference between the two. Last empirical test. Now, here I show you in green the relationship between labor force participation and child tax credit eligibility after the expiration of the benefit. Pink is the relationship during the benefit. If if the child tax credit caused a labor supply reduction, we would expect for the green line to be everywhere greater than the pink line, and we would expect for that gap to be greatest for the households who qualify for a larger child tax credit benefit. We don't see that. If you test for statistical difference between the two lines, there is no difference, and you don't see any differential effect for the lowest income households. And this last graph runs the placebo analysis in 2019. Again, the lines are on top of each other, and we see no statistical difference between after the placebo benefit expires. And so to conclude, we fail to detect any significant changes in labor force participation at the onset or expiration of the extended child tax credit. So that fails to support the hypothesis that work requirements are efficient or socially optimal. One caveat, of course, is that we only look at short-term effects. So the effects may differ in the long run, and we can't speak to that given the design and the nature of the law, which was itself temporary. So there's a lot of other things that we show in the paper: small increase in employment, decrease in unemployment. We have a bunch of other fun statistical things, so check out the paper if you're interested. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Oh, thank you. I love it. My name is Nicole Russo. I'm a principal behavioral designer at Ideas 42, as Jack said. And we're really excited to be here today to share some of what we've learned and what we've been doing to shift harmful narratives about guaranteed income. So we're going to start. I'll share some insights from a national level survey that we ran about 2 years ago. Then Eric will talk a little bit about what we've been doing in Jackson to shift harmful narratives in partnership with Springboard to Opportunities and the Magnolia Mothers Trust. And then we'll just close with a couple of words about where our work is headed. Before I dive into that, I just want to say a few things about who we are and what we do. Ideas 42 is a nonprofit behavioral research and design firm. We use a deeper understanding of human behavior to design and build innovative solutions to address persistent social challenges around the world. And we draw from decades of research in behavioral science and the fields that you see here on the screen, as well as our 15 years as a global leader in the emerging field of behavioral design. And for the last 3 years, we've been explicitly focused on shifting harmful narratives to unlock more generous social policy. So let's dive into some of the insights from this national survey. So one of the guiding questions that Jack actually put to us, and that is very timely given Brandon's paper, was that people seem to like the stimulus checks and the expanded child tax credit during COVID, but none of that it lasted beyond 2022. So what happened? We think harmful narratives happened because we know that narratives, or the stories and the collections of stories we use to interpret and understand the world around us, move people, and people move policy. Harmful narratives don't just stay in the silo of our minds. They make their way into design choices about how we set up social systems, policies, and programs. This is an example of a quote from Tate Reeves, governor of Mississippi. He says, he's talking about the COVID-19 rental assistance program. He says, this program has essentially become, if for whatever reason you can't pay your rent or utility bill, taxpayers will pay them for you. Mississippi will continue to say no to these types of liberal handouts that encourage people to stay out of the workforce. Instead, we're going to say yes to conservative principles and policies that result in more people working. So it's hard to even read this out loud, especially in this space, but it's really important, right? You can see what he's doing here. He's spinning a really harmful and a false narrative between the relationship between government assistance and support and benefits and work. And this matters because when people hear these stories and they hear these narratives, it makes them less likely to support generous social policies and programs that we know work, like guaranteed income. So what we set out to do was to understand the degree to which these harmful narratives are prevalent across the US. And in order to do that, we first needed to define what we were talking about when we say harmful narratives. And that work resulted on the 5 core narrative constructs that you see here on the screen. So I won't read each of the quotes. We're very happy to share this afterwards, but I'll just describe each of them briefly. So the personal failure narrative suggests that people living in poverty are lazy and stupid. The welfare fraud narrative purports that people who receive benefits will exploit the system for their own gain. Meritocracy says that the American dream is alive and well, and it is available to anyone willing to work hard enough for it. Fatalism says that poverty is an unavoidable consequence of capitalism and other factors that we can't change. And lastly, paternalism. We need to make decisions for people experiencing poverty because they can't be trusted to make choices for themselves. Again, all of these are very harmful and very false, and in some cases they can be deadly. Now, what we did after we defined what these narratives were was to measure the degree to which they showed up in the general population. So we did that through a national level survey of just over 1,100 folks from a demographically representative sample of the US. We did this in early 2021 using a market research platform known as Lucid. And what we found was that almost all of these narratives were widely endorsed by the population that we surveyed. Everything except for the personal failure narrative, which again was that narrative that said people experiencing poverty are lazy or stupid. And this was reassuring, but what was not so reassuring was that 50% or more of people endorsed these other 4 narratives. And if you can see on the right-hand side, the welfare fraud narrative is the highest endorsed, which speaks to perhaps why we face so much difficulty in expanding and scaling guaranteed income, because it is one of the most generous social benefits we can possibly offer. And while we found that things like income and politics do matter, right? So if you are higher income or you identify as male, you are more likely to support these harmful narratives. Conversely, if you hold a college degree, if you identify as a Democrat or an independent, or if you say that religion plays a low importance in your life, you're less likely to endorse these narratives, which none of this was really surprising. It wasn't surprising to us at the time, but what was really surprising was that these things actually matter a whole lot less than some other things, like worldviews. Worldviews matter much more than those other traditional demographics I just showed when predicting likelihood of endorsing harmful narratives. These are things like racial resentment, a symbolic measure of racism, right-wing authoritarianism, or the likelihood that you submit to traditional authorities and conventions of society that you believe that authorities are generally right, or social dominance orientation, the likelihood to agree that there's a natural hierarchy to society and some people always have to be on top, so therefore there will always be people on the bottom. Endorsing any one of these worldviews is far more predictive than any of the other demographics that I just showed in harmful narrative endorsement. The other thing that really matters are thinking styles. So if you're the type of person who tends to see the world in black and white as opposed to shades of gray, or you prefer to intuit your way through the world using your sort of gut sense to decide important questions or make judgments, you are also much more likely to endorse these harmful narratives. And the really interesting thing is that neither thinking styles nor worldviews are unique to party affiliation or ideology. This graph is showing the degree to which party affiliation spans agreement with the social dominance orientation worldview. And what you can see is that Democrats are pretty well spread out across this threshold, right? From left to right of low to highest agreement. And in the highest agreement column on the right-hand side, you can see that Democrats actually make up more of that population than Republicans, who are shown in red. So it's clear to us that shifting harmful narratives about poverty and people experiencing poverty is an everybody issue. It is not inherently political. And what we think this adds to the discourse is that we all need to be thinking differently about how we target audiences with our campaigns, especially as we're thinking about scaling and increasing the support for a guaranteed income. So I'm actually going to pass it over to Eric. He's going to come up and talk about what we've been doing to take some of this research into practice in shifting harmful narratives about guaranteed income in Jackson.
Yes, thank you, Nicole, for that. As Nicole just alluded to, I'll be talking a little bit about the work that we are doing in Jackson, Mississippi, where we are seeking to combat the harmful narratives as they pertain to cash policy, as well as guaranteed basic income. Work that we do with Springboard to Opportunities, as Nicole just mentioned. We work closely with Springboard to Opportunities, the orchestrators of the Magnolia Mothers Trust, if any of you are familiar with that. And yeah, we can get some views for that. That's incredible. Yeah, that's great. They are instrumental in the work that we do. They convene the space. They identify local partners to join our coalition, as well as target stakeholders and beneficiaries. And who are we kidding? They cut a lot of the checks, so we keep them very happy. I'm going to walk you through some of the steps. This is a typical sequence of steps within our narrative change process across our locations and sites within the United States. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the findings specifically related to Jackson here. But this is a great little introduction to kind of how we go about our work as it relates to narrative change. It starts with researching the harmful narratives that exist with any given site, location, city, what have you. Because as we know, while there are common themes that exist throughout different locations, different sites, different communities, they're very tailored and unique differences depending on where you're working in. So we always start by identifying and articulating the harmful narrative per city and location, identified by the community and stakeholders. We try to do as little of that work as possible. We move on. Once we understand what the harmful narratives might be, we start to investigate the psychological mechanisms that might obstruct or provide a little bit of resistance to the support of cash policies or guaranteed basic income. Because understanding the psychosocial factors that underpin the obstruction is one of the biggest keys to unlocking progress towards support. Next, we get into a phase of co-design, where once again, I need to really articulate here, when we say co-design, we mean co-design. We do not parachute in and just try to tell everyone what they need to do based upon the principles of behavioral science. It's not about what we're doing. It is led by the local communities and local organizations. We call them local narrative teams, and those are our local coalitions that exist in every site that we work in. We have community steering committees that exist in a lot of these sites, community circles who come together and inform the designs of our campaigns and interventions. After that, we move on to creating a narrative change toolkit. This is a collection of artifacts that can sustain and scale the work long after the project is over and we have left. So they can do the work and continue to progress, evolve it as it needs to. And then finally, we measure everything we do because we wouldn't be a science-based organization if we didn't. I want to talk to you all a little bit today about a local narrative survey we did in Jackson, Mississippi, as Nicole just described and explained. We did a lot of national work, but in every city, we also work on a local narrative investigation to try to understand what's happening with the narratives, and in our particular case in Jackson, attitudes and beliefs towards guaranteed basic income within the communities. And we're going to start with the top line here, right? Because I think this is something a lot of us will agree with or be able to identify with very quickly. When we ask the residents of Jackson, how valuable would guaranteed basic income be? Or do we think that's something that the communities would approve of? We get pretty high rates of agreement. People think it would be valuable. Everyone loves money, right? I'd love an extra check every month. And we see pretty high means for these items. However, when we dig a bit deeper, exact same sample, we find that there's a little bit of tension here. There are a couple nuances. It gets a little bit murkier. As we look at topics such as deservingness, we can see a certain participant in our sample who stated, I think a guaranteed income program is worthwhile if the recipients continue to work. Employment should be mandatory. Or how value might be manipulated or shifted based on these types of programs. Another participant in the sample stated, "I believe that anyone who is capable of work should do that first. It's not the government's responsibility to take care of you if you are able-bodied." The plot continues to thicken here. As we continue to look at the intersection and interactions between attitudes and beliefs towards guaranteed basic income and the harmful narratives that Nicole just described, we found that the higher number of concerns you had for guaranteed basic income, the more predictive or the higher the association was that you would endorse the harmful narratives that Nicole just mentioned. This was especially true for the welfare exploitation and the provision of services. Now, what does this all mean? I don't want us to walk away. Please do not leave today. Be like, "Eric, all you told us was negative stuff. This is not what I'm here for," right? What I'm trying to demonstrate and illustrate here is that people are complicated. People hold within them multitudes, right? We're pluralities by existence. And I think these findings are reflective of that true fact. So how might we increase support for GBI? Well, we have 3 takeaways we'd like you to walk away with. 3 things that we think could be very powerful in our fight, in our crusade to help increase access to guaranteed basic income. The first of which is segment audiences by worldviews and thinking styles, looking at the psychosocial factors and typologies, the mechanisms of our psychology that underpin support for guaranteed basic income, as opposed to traditional demographics such as political party, race, gender, all the things we might see on that census form sheet. The second here is to address the harmful poverty narratives at its root, at its source. So looking at how the psychology start to interact with the harmful narratives, we can begin to disentangle the psychosocial factors that drive support or obstruction for guaranteed basic income and start to unpack some of that resistance that endures via cultural mechanisms or via things of our demographics that might persist and obstruct guaranteed basic income progression. And then finally, we would be remiss if we did not mention behavioral science. We don't have enough time to unpack this fully. Please do ask us questions and come find us later. But we truly believe that behavioral science might be the key ingredient or the missing puzzle piece in our narrative change approach. That is behavioral science, the science that is understanding why people do what they do and providing us the tools to help us enact the changes that we'd like to see in our populations and communities. Using a behavioral science approach, we can start to promote counter-narratives, we can start to shift beliefs and attitudes, and we can change behaviors that will enable support for guaranteed basic income. That is a brief glance of the work that we're doing in Jackson. It's early stages in the journey, so we're very excited to see where it goes. I'm going to hand it over to Nicole just to close us out here with a couple of closing comments.
Thank you, Eric. I'm just going to say a couple of quick words and then we'll be finished up here. So what are we doing next? We're working in 7 cities across the United States. Our 2 newest cities, Jackson, which Eric just talked about, and Atlanta, are explicitly focused on guaranteed income. Big shout out to the Grow Fund and in her Hands program. They gave a great presentation earlier this morning. In addition to starting those programs and moving into this focus for guaranteed income, we're going to also be continuing our work in our other cities, which has been focused more generally and more broadly on building support for generous social policy across the spectrum. We're taking the pilots that we have run and the research that we have done to better understand how we scale those, reach them to other cities, and understand what's working and what's not, and improve upon the things that we can. In addition, we're going to be continuing to do nationwide research and local research in each city to better understand how harmful narratives manifest, what drives them, as well as what is effective in countering them. And lastly, we are also beginning to build a national coalition for this work, so we really hope you'll join us. We would like to bring folks together, amplify each other's work and voices, share insights and learnings with policymakers, advocates, general public, and most importantly, with the communities that we work with. Our goal in this work is to start building the capacity of our partners and our community members to do this work without us and to continue to take this forward long after we're gone. I think this morning we talked about how this movement needs to become a movement, move into grassroots organizing, bring the folks that benefit, the folks who are served by these programs to the table to be in the work with us to shift policy at a larger scale so that this can be sustainable long term. So please do feel free to reach out to us. We can be found at Eric or at Nicole at ideas42.org, and we would love to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, all our presenters. That was really incredible. I am supposed to give some comments and questions for Brandon's presentation, but I really want to leave maximum time for audience questions. So I'm just going to briefly summarize that we did kind of a natural experiment in a basic income for families with the expanded CTC. One of the main objections to that policy is that, it's going to cause all these people to stop working. Like if you ask people before we did this, a lot of skeptical people, they would have, their doomsday predictions. And what Brandon found in his extremely rigorous research is that really labor force participation did not change at all. So with that, I'm going to kick it to Sarah, who's going to have some questions about that great Ideas 42 presentation.
Yes. Hi. To the mic. So I'm not presenting the work that I've done on narratives, but I'll just say a little bit about it. I think it intersects sort of nicely. One question I focused on, so I work on narratives both around poverty and social policy, but also climate change. And these are very difficult topics to shift narratives on in the US in particular. And one thing that comes from sort of the climate literature is I've focused on people who are in the middle when we look at support for unconditional cash transfers, to try and understand what the values are, what their sort of values are, what their concerns about cash transfers are, and their narratives around cash transfers, and to try and understand the potential for these kinds of cross-cutting coalitions, or building these coalitions that include people who already support these policies and those who are sort of on the fence. Another part of the work has been to look at how people's support, when we do see bipartisan support or broad sort of moderate support for some of these policies, how they're changed by information about policy details. So once people find out about different financing mechanisms or who's eligible, or how the policies are going to be structured in terms of how frequently people are going to receive money. So those also, you might find broad support or like moderate support, but once you start pulling out these policy details, you see much different, narrower groups sort of forming in support or opposition to these different policy details. So that's some of the work I've done, also in part with the Jane Family Institute, so I just wanted to say that. And I think I had a couple questions, and so one thing I wanted to ask is seeing both of these presentations together, one which is very data-driven and not so much about narratives, but very much informed narratives around, how people think about the impacts on labor and labor requirements, and how that, impacted the possibility of having an expanded CTC more permanently. And so I was curious how you guys thought about each other's talks, first of all, and what opportunity you see there in terms of learning from the more database study and thinking about how to construct narratives around that. And then I was also curious to what extent in your research you think we should be focusing on counteracting negative or oppositional narratives versus creating new positive narratives or leveraging existing positive narratives. And so if you've done any work that speaks to which one's more effective and what the strategies are for creating these positive sort of counter narratives, if you could speak to that a little bit. And then I have a bunch of other questions as well that I can come back to, or we can open it up.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see the research. It's just so refreshing and validating to see it on the screen in the hard numbers and the econometrics of it. I think that it's so effective when it comes to speaking to certain audiences, having that research, when I'm talking to other folks who need to see it, right, who are policy wonks or who are maybe even elected officials that are like, show me the data, what we have found in our work is actually, and there have been studies that show this, that when you show the general public data, they're actually less likely to react positively than if you just tell them stories. And there's evidence that shows this, which is that when you're trying to shift broad-based public opinions, it's stories that do that. It is not data. And actually, when you show people a story and the data coupled with it, you would think that would be really powerful, less powerful than just telling stories. So I think we have to be thoughtful about how we use data, who we talk about it to, and the ways that we sort of leverage it as we do these campaigns and think about audience. But I love seeing it, so it was great to see your presentation.
I'm happy to let Brandon go before I definitely have comments.
Yeah, so I think I'm not an expert in narratives, I will say. I think one thing that's nice is knowing that the narratives, so I think you can think about data as a collection of people's stories, because every time you survey somebody in the current population survey, which is the data set that we used, like they're telling you about some aspects of themselves, and we're aggregating that into generalizable information. And so I think that like it's can be reassuring to know that like the narratives and the data are all pointing in the same direction.
Hey, Brandon, that was really that was beautiful, man. Bring tears to my eyes. Yeah, the data is a collection of people's stories. How great
Eric's
is
a
that? Yeah. I love that. Well, I'll just speak to the synergies and the intersections here. I think the data is becoming very clear in the stories that it's telling, but the one thing that's very frustrating is sitting around and seeing the same decisions being made despite the data kind of pointing in an opposite direction. So I'm glad to see that that's continuing to strengthen, but I know that is not the length of the work that we need to do. You asked a second question there about what's more important, or what's the calculus there of focusing on the negative narratives that persist and endure throughout all of our communities across the country, or focusing on promoting the positive counter narratives, or what we also like to call authentic narratives. I'm not sure if that's the common parlance in the space, but it's really difficult, because the shared lexicon and the shared language that's used, sometimes there's a lot of intersection and interaction between the languages, and it feels a little disingenuous to not look at the monsters and to not say, here's what the harmful narratives are. However, we do recognize in every city that we go to that it is key, vital, that we articulate a counter-narrative and authentic narrative that represents the positive aspects of the community and culture. And again, that is always defined by the local communities, and that goes at the forefront of everything on top of any harmful narrative that we might point to.
And one of the things, just to add to that we really focus on is doing our best to not repeat the myth, right? Don't repeat the harmful narrative. It makes me even uncomfortable to do it on screen and show you all those harmful narratives. We do it for the purpose of sort of sharing the work, but that's one of the core tenets of what we do is once we know what we're addressing, once we've talked to the community, as Eric said, about, okay, what are the monsters? What are the bad things that are being said about your community that are false and that are harmful? Okay, we know what they are, let's set them aside. From that moment forward, we focus on the counter-narrative or the authentic narrative, because repeating the myth, even to bust it, can be really harmful because you give it longitude and latitude, right? You give it credence just by saying, well, that thing's not true. You're talking about it, and by talking about it, you're showing people that it does have some weight because you need to talk about it. So in all of our work, what we've been trying to do is once we have defined with the community what are the stories that you want told that are not being told about your community, from that moment forward, it's all about sharing those and amplifying those.
Great. Maybe I'll ask, do I have time to ask
One more
question? Okay. So the other question, I'm sort of packing a few questions into one, but I'll try to make this quick. So you presented results from this nationally representative survey where you have these very, these kind of like broad findings where things like thinking styles impact the way that people think about welfare, or think about poverty or deservingness. And I think one of your suggestions at the end was that the population should be segmented by worldviews or thinking styles rather than ideology, political ideology. And so I was wondering if you could reflect on, one, how are you proposing targeted narratives for different segments, and how would we go about doing this, given that that's not, we might have proxies for ideology, or we might know where people are clustered in terms of partisanship, but we don't really know this for thinking style. Are you suggesting that there should be more sort of like broad surveys done? And then to what extent are some of these negative narratives or positive narratives location specific and policy specific? So these pilots have taken many different forms, and that can create different constituents that support a broader version of these policies. And so to what extent do you have to focus in on the local details of the pilot that you're working, the location that you're working on?
Want me to start?
Sure.
Okay. What was your first question again?
About the segmenting.
Yes,
and
of course.
thinking styles.
So yes, I think that it would be really effective if we could do some local research to understand the degree to which people agree with certain harmful worldviews and have certain thinking styles. So to the degree that it's feasible for us to be conducting those locally when we are developing authentic narratives and counter-narrative campaigns in cities or in communities, that's something that I would love to see us do more of. It's sort of a call to action equally for us to everyone. And that's what we have been doing in each of our cities, is understanding what the makeup is of that population, not just by traditional demographics, but also by these other things like worldviews and thinking styles. And I also think that it's really important to think about the harmful narratives that show up locally and by policy. So, our work in the Bronx looks very different than our work in Detroit. We're addressing totally different harmful narratives. The Bronx, we're focused on fatalism. In Detroit, we're thinking about paternalism. And so that just showed up when we asked people, through a lot of listening, what is showing up for you? And I think that's the first key step, is to sit with community and say, what are the stories that are harming you that are being told? Because they are different for every community. Even within a city, they might be different in different neighborhoods.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. I apologize for hyping the audience questions, but we're gonna have to wrap up. The beautiful thing about an in-person conference, you're not clicking a red button saying end meeting. More questions, you can find these people. They're gonna be around. But thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for all our presenters. I wish we could go on for another 20 minutes. But last thing, I'm supposed to ask people to stay for a quick wrap-up.